College Boat Club, and I'm particularly pleased that we can welcome some freshers who are joining us. We also have some current students who are back at Selwyn. We have around about 200 students back in residence already ahead of the start of term next week. And we also have alumni and friends joining us from Britain and from around the world. And it's a big turnout tonight because we have a very special guest, Richard Budgett, who is the Medical and Scientific Director of the International Olympic Committee. And that's why he's in Lausanne. Equally important from a Selwyn point of view, he's a Selwyn alumnus. He is an Olympic gold medal winner, Los Angeles in 1984. And as you'll hear, has also had an incredible range of roles in sport over the last decades, and is still very heavily involved as the IOC and everyone else prepares for Tokyo 2021, as it will now, of course, become. Now, all through tonight's chat, if you want to ask questions of Richard, use the chat facility on Zoom, and we will be very keen indeed to hear from you. And what's going to happen is I'm going to talk to Richard for maybe 10 or 15 minutes just to sketch in the main points of his career, and you're then very welcome to throw in questions about anything that has come up during that period. So, Richard, if I can both say welcome and ask you first, presumably you had rowed a bit before you got to Selwyn.
Yes, I had rowed at school and arrived at Selwyn, and I assumed I would carry on rowing at the college. And I must admit, I had 3 glorious years of rowing at Selwyn College. Obviously, I was studying medicine as well, and that took a bit of time, but we did spend a lot of time down at the river.
Now, being somebody who went on to win a gold medal, I assume you're in the boat race.
Well, no, I wasn't actually. I did trial for the squad in my last year, and I got to the last 20, and then got thrown out. And actually, at the time, I was very relieved because it meant I could go on the Oxford and Cambridge ski trip, which I was dying to go on. And I learnt to ski actually while I was at university, and it's been a passion ever since. So it's wonderful living out here in Switzerland. But so at the time, it didn't mean too much to me, but actually a year later I was in the national squad and got selected in a pair to row at the World Championships, and won a surprising bronze medal with Tonka Hudson. And I remember I've still got the cuttings somewhere, at least I think my mother has, which says Cambridge reject gets bronze medal. So that was quite nice. But I never felt too tough about it because I had such fun rowing at Selwyn, and we always went to Henley every year in those days. And in the last year, we did a combined 8 with Claire, and much to our and everyone else's surprise, actually got to the Saturday of Henley. So this caused much shock. But in retrospect, looking back, 2 of the individuals in that crew went on to row internationally. So we had some ringers in the crew, even though we didn't know it at the time.
I was going to say, you started at Selwyn in 1977, so you're talking about the late 70s when you didn't make the boat race. When you won a gold medal in 1984, did you talk to the people who turned you down for the Cambridge crew?
I'm sorry, your sound was just breaking up then. What was the question again?
The question was, you were active in rowing at Selwyn in the late 70s. When you won the gold medal in 1984, did you talk to the people who turned you down for the boat race crew?
Yes, and some of them are my great friends, and I knew the president of the boat club at the time very well indeed. And I think looking back, one of the things is the way they trialled then was you were thrown in an 8, and if you looked good, then you got through to the next parts. And ironically, if I'd lasted a little bit longer than the last 20, then we would have been on in smaller boats, and then I could have had a chance to show I could make the boat go fast, even though I wasn't the prettiest oarsman in the world at the time. And of course, in those days, which I'm very grateful for now, there were no rowing machines. And those of you who have rowed more recently will know that is one of the sort of hardships of rowing these days, is the hours that people have to spend on the rowing ergometer. So we never had that, which meant that I was never tested to see what power I was putting out, which is quite interesting.
Just tell us, what was the sporting process for you in going from a college rower in Cambridge to an Olympic medalist? So what was the kind of thing that lifted you up to that world-beating standard?
Well, there's one word for that, and it's training. And it's true that the body, the physiology does respond to training. So I'd never trained as hard as I did when I came down to London. And every week I thought, that's enough. I'm going to be thrown out any moment now, so it doesn't matter, and I can have a rest. But managed to keep going, and then eventually the fruits come from it. And I always remember coming up to the actual Olympic year. Our coach, Mike Spracklin, started training us 3 times a day, which in those days was unheard of. You trained twice a day and that was it. So suddenly we were up to 3 times a day, and it made us go even faster. So as long as you can recover from that training, it'll work.
And tell us about being an Olympian. And obviously, we're familiar with the pictures when people win the gold medal, but I can't avoid the question: what does it feel like?
Well, yes, a good question. I think everyone has individual reactions to actually winning a gold medal, because sometimes it's unexpected and sometimes it's expected. Now, when I was with Steve Redgrave in that 4 and Martin Cross and Andy Holmes, we were actually the favourites. Everyone thought we were going to win. And I'll never forget, one of the members of the British Eight came to me the night before the race and said, "Richard, you're so lucky. All you've got to do is turn up on your win." But of course, it wasn't quite like that. And we were actually behind for most of the race and came through to win in the end. So actually, in a funny sort of way, my first sensation was relief, because we expected to get the gold medal at that point, because we'd beaten the East Germans and the Russians before we went to Los Angeles, and then the Americans were our main rivals. And then obviously the relief turns to joy and all the rest of it. But and it's funny because normally, I mean, I'll never forget the bumps. You're so nervous, aren't you, when you're lining up on the bumps? And any big race, the adrenaline's pumping and you're trying to keep relaxed, but you're getting more and more nervous. And before that Olympic final, I was trying to relax in my normal way, which was to say, look, this is just rowing. It doesn't matter. It won't change my life. I'm going on to be a doctor. And then I suddenly thought, oh my goodness, this is definitely going to change my life. And it did. So anyway, the first few strokes are a little bit wobbly, but after that, you just get into the groove and you go.
And of course, when you see people under that extraordinary pressure, which is the race that's going to determine the rest of their life, and they're being watched by a global audience running into hundreds of millions of people, how do you perform at the very peak of your ability when that pressure must be really intense?
Yes, it's interesting. And I think that's one of the psychologies that makes people successful at that highest level, that you can produce your very best performance when it really, really matters, and use that adrenaline and that fight or flight response positively rather than negatively, and reach the optimum arousal. So that's a skill that's learned, I think. And on an amusing aside, I always remember one of the divers, when I was looking after a lot of the British team, saying to me, when he's standing on that top diving board in just his little Speedos, he must make sure he doesn't think about millions of people looking at him standing there. So you can't come out of yourself. You've just got to be totally focused on the race that's coming, or the performance or event that's coming. And it's something that most people can learn to do, but some people sadly never do. They'll produce their best performances in training. They may be fantastic athletes, but never actually produce that on the day.
Now, the Olympics do have a magic still, and clearly, if you look at your career through being the team doctor, even for I think bobsleigh in the Winter Olympics, through to Team GB, and then London 2012, where you were chief medical officer, was there something about the Olympics that made you think that was something you wanted to be involved in, and it would become your life?
Yes, I mean, obviously, it's something that has huge appeal to anyone who's into sport and involved and enthusiastic, and everyone understands the Olympics. So it was quite soon after I got through my medical training that I was really determined to go into sport and exercise medicine. And I was just really fortunate that where I was doing my GP training up in Harrow, Northwick Park Hospital, they opened the British Olympic Medical Centre. So I went down dangling my gold medal and said, can I come and do some research here? And they took me on straight away, so it does help. And I started doing some research, and that led on to doing actual sport medicine and eventually looking after the team.
And it sounds like a daft question, but if you are the team doctor to bobsleigh, what do you actually do?
Yes, no, it's not a daft question at all. I mean, it's the same with most sports, because you're not actually, you've got a small number of people. You're not actually going to be treating them all the time, are you? So there's a bit of general support and injury prevention working with the rest of the team. But I wouldn't travel the team all the time. I would go out several weekends a year to support them, to do a review, to deal with issues, and then you muck in. And that's one of the great things about being part of a support team. So I would stand on the edge of the bobsleigh track with a video camera, try not to fall in, and getting teased when I missed the bobsleigh completely because they go past so fast. No, I think anyone who wants to go into sport medicine, being a team doctor is something you have to be passionate about, but it's hugely rewarding because you've got a group of athletes who you're really able to look after in huge detail. Practice holistic medicine, hopefully these days as part of a multidisciplinary team. We had really good physiotherapists with us, but now you have nutritionists and psychologists and all sorts.
And how does the role change when you go from an individual sport? And you, of course, did rowing as well as the more esoteric, such as bobsleigh. When you become the overall team doctor, does that become more about performance, or is it about drugs and doping, or what does the main focus become when you get that bigger role?
That's a good point. Obviously, anti-doping is a very important part of the team doctor's role, making sure everyone's educated. I used to spend a lot of time, and then when I was chief medical officer for Team GB, making sure all the team went through a really careful check of everything that was in their possession that might possibly be contaminated or cause a problem. So really, I suppose when I became the chief medical officer, that is more of an administrative role. But there was still a lot of hands-on, and I was still working at our Olympic Medical Center, so I was seeing athletes on a daily basis. So it was still clinical, but it wasn't actually traveling with the teams, except going to training camp, pre-Olympic training camps, and the Olympics themselves, which was still fantastic experience. And at the Olympics, you tend to have a core team of doctors. We'd have 5 or 6 in headquarters, and then some of the bigger teams would have their own doctors. So there were a lot of doctors at the games.
Now, you became Chief Medical Officer for London 2012, which is working for the organisers. And I suppose that's where you and I intersected a bit, in that I was running the BBC operation for London 2012, and you were looking after the whole of the sort of medical side of the operation. There's a question coming actually from Mark Hutchinson, and I would encourage people, do keep asking questions via chat. But Mark says, knowing what you know today about doping, what should have been done differently in Olympics 2012 with hindsight?
Yes, that's a really good question. I mean, obviously, I see it through slightly rose-tinted spectacles, but it was the first games where really intelligence was used, which is where you're seeing where the pockets of doping are, and then extrapolating for that, who are the coaches, who are the other athletes who might be involved, and then targeting those groups of athletes, those sports, those disciplines, those countries where you feel they're at higher risk. And so UK anti-doping did that, and that was the first time it had been done in a systematic way at the games. So you could look at it that the huge number of positives that have been now in the reanalysis program we've run at the IOC is actually a tribute to the intelligent testing that was done at the time of the games. So we picked up really a lot of samples from athletes who were at risk. Now, what happened was this long-term metabolite test became available in 2013, so it simply wasn't validated. They knew it might be coming, but you weren't able to use it in 2012. But then in 2013, it was validated, started coming into operation in 2014, and then we started the reanalysis program, and that picked up all those individuals who've been taking the traditional anabolic steroids, and they've been taking them for decades, but in small doses, stopping well before events, knowing they could get away with it because you washed out from their system. But with this new test, we can detect them for for months, not just a week or so, but for months. And so, not surprisingly, loads of them were caught. So, a lot of people say, "Oh, the most doping tests ever at the London Games," but actually, it uncovered a practice in certain sports, the weightlifting, the athletics, the wrestling, in certain countries, with the coaches, I have to say the Russian-speaking coaches mostly, but lots of spread around that part of the world, and that's it picked up the custom and practice there, in those particular sports and disciplines, and I hope provided a huge deterrent to those who are thinking they can carry on doing that. So it was a good example, and the other thing, apart from being a deterrent in retrospect, it means that there are a lot of people who should have got a medal at the time have now at last, albeit very belatedly, been awarded a medal.
Okay, I mean, for me, it was the most glorious 17 days of my life and an honour to be part of it. But for you and the team who did an extraordinary job, does it then hurt when you see headlines now saying the dirtiest Olympics?
No, because I know, dare I say, what journalists are like, and you need to get a good headline, don't you? I think most people will know that it wasn't the fault of the testing. It wasn't the fault of the regime. It was that was uncovering a reality, and we all knew that there was more than 0.0 something % of people cheating. There were more people than that cheating, and there probably still are, I'm afraid. This is just you can't bury your head in your sand. You've got to go out there and find the offenders, and then educate, persuade, and try and change the whole system.
Richard, I want to keep asking questions that people are putting in, because they are incredibly interesting, and we'll then come on to your IOC role and Tokyo. But Andrew Miskin on testing: no testing is ever 100% reliable. How do you deal with potential false positives at drug testing?
Yes, that's a really, really good question. But there is a B sample, which has some role there to make sure that the findings are confirmed in another analysis. So that is a big reassurance. But actually, the detection of the samples is very reliable. It's exactly the interpretation of that's the real issue. And I'm afraid to say that I think a significant minority of the athletes who have an adverse analytical finding, they're actually not trying to cheat. They're just being stupid. They're taking something they shouldn't take. It's a supplement or a contamination. Sometimes they're completely innocent. Mostly it's, well, they were sailing a bit close to the wind, but they didn't think they were cheating. And then there are those who are clearly cheating, taking things like erythropoietin or anabolic steroids, and really there's no excuse for that at all.
Sam Coombe, a recent student, as part of the retesting program, did the IOC eventually retest all medal holders, such that there can be confidence now that all medals were legitimately gained?
We didn't test every single sample, because there were thousands of samples from the games, but used what I described earlier as the intelligent testing to produce a test distribution plan. Well over half the samples were reanalyzed, and it focused on the sports where we know there's an issue, so weightlifting more than archery. But there were at least some medalists tested from every single sport and discipline. And luckily at the Games since 2012, and actually before that, there have been testing not just of the medalists, but of the sort of 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th place in many sports. So you could go down the rankings and award medals to people confident that they were clean, because you'd reanalyze their sample as well. But having said that, there were 1 or 2 disciplines in weightlifting where you go down to 7 and they all turn out positive. And that produces issues, because the doping there was so rife back in the early 2000s.
Question from Sophie Penny, another recent alumna who has been working, I'm afraid, in journalism. But Sophie, her question: in your experience, do medical treatments and interventions in sport vary enough to take into account people's diverse characteristics, such as gender and race?
Well, I think that's a very good question because we're sort of more and more into personalized medicine, aren't we? I think it leads on to another issue, which is the vulnerability of athletes, particularly elite athletes, where your whole future um, lies on being absolutely in the best possible form. And so they're vulnerable to fads and gurus. And there's always the temptation, as a team doctor as well, you're trying to do the very best for them. To take treatments that this might work. There's a good theoretical reason why it might, but actually the proper evidence isn't there. So we all glibly say evidence-based medicine, and certainly in sport and exercise medicine, there's a real drive to use evidence-based medicine, but it's enormously challenging. I know for some team doctors where they're being pushed to use the latest treatment from someone who is considered as the guru. So I think personalized medicine, along with using evidence-based medicine, is really important. It's something we have to champion, and something we have to educate all our colleagues about. And we've got a lot of online education with the IOC, and I know certainly there's sport and exercise medicine training actually really started in the UK. It ran the first courses, and now there are several at several universities as well as online courses. So dare I say it, but sitting here in Lausanne, I would say the UK are way ahead.
Okay, so you're now, as I said, medical and scientific director of the International Olympic Committee. What do you do?
Well, my biggest priority is to make sure the games are safe for all the participants, and to protect the health, particularly of the athletes. And if we don't get it right at the games, then we forget about all the other things we do. But actually, as well as obviously preparing for the games, liaising with the organizer committee, I've changed hats. I'm sort of poacher turned gamekeeper, having been the chief medical officer in London, sitting there in slight trepidation when the medical director from the IOC came, Patrick Shamash. I'm now in that position where I'm going out to meet the chief medical officers and all their teams to see how the preparations are going. So that's really the core of it. But then we do a lot of other work which is centered around both education and research. And so the education, more and more of it's remote now, but we do hold some big conferences, advanced team physician courses. We prioritize prevention of injury and illness, and we have consensus statements on areas where either not being addressed properly, the evidence base isn't as good as it should be, there's controversy, there's poor take-up of a particular form of treatment, or it's something that needs to be highlighted. So we've had recent ones on everything from the adolescent knee through to mental health in athletes, and prevention of harassment and abuse in sport, and transgender. So it covers a multitude of difficult areas, and those consensus statements are very useful. And then we both stimulate research through a network of research centers around the world, and there's 11 of those in every continent, spread through every continent, and also through research grants. And then, although I try and not be totally overwhelmed by it, and a lot of questions, I am still involved with anti-doping. Although there is now the International Testing Agency, who decide all the testing is done at the games. They organize it, so it's totally independent from the IOC. I can't think, I don't want to test Usain Bolt because it might be positive. No, we've got an independent organization who are doing that. But we're still very involved in making sure that they are producing the standard of doping control that we need, and with the World Anti-Doping Agency, who are setting the rules and the policies under which all the anti-doping organizations work. And the IOC contribute half their funding, so we're very involved with that.
And I'm sure the big question everybody wants to know is, are we going to have a Games in Tokyo next year?
I lost a bit of your question there, Roger, but I think you were saying, are we going ahead next year?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. I think we've always had the line that this is the Olympic Games, Tokyo 2020, postponed to 2021. It's definitely going ahead. There's total commitment from Japan. And I think, being honest, in the last couple of months, there's reality has come to that. So there is really more and more confidence that we will do it. All right, it might not be the games that we know. It might not be in the form of previous games, but an Olympic Games will happen in Tokyo in 2021. Because we've seen so many sports around the world restarting. There'll be enormous challenges about getting everybody qualified who deserves to be qualified, and then getting them to Japan, absolutely minimizing the risk of any infection either in that group who go or in the local population, using testing, isolation, quarantine. Maybe there'll be a vaccine. There's a bit more hope on that now, isn't there? So that's not a silver bullet, because of course vaccination is never going to be 100%. But if there is a vaccine available, that will reduce the chances of an outbreak at the games and make everybody more confident that we can hold a safe games. So there is an enormous amount of work going on with scenarios, with planning with our Japanese colleagues in the World Health Organization, with many others as well. Well, as we've all seen, the amount of resource and expertise and brilliance that's been thrown at this problem is just awesome. And so we're in sport just a little part of that.
Richard Pelly asks a question, apart from coronavirus, what are the big issues from your perspective and your big responsibilities for Tokyo?
Heat. And to be absolutely frank with you, that was one of my slight disappointments, in that we couldn't actually move the month of the games when we were postponing it. But it was just all sorts of good reasons why that couldn't be done, which I have to accept. So we have a heat expert group with some of the best experts in the world. And I suppose that's one of the joys of working for the IOC, is that if we've got an issue, if you've got something we want to tackle, we can approach really people from all over the world, the very best people in the world, and 9 times out of 10 they'll say yes, we'll help, because it's the Olympics and the Olympic Games. So we hope, and I'm sure we will, leave a legacy from the Games when it comes to competing and training in the heat. There's already been a consensus on that a few years ago, and this will be redone after the Games, so we benefit from all the new learnings. And there's a lot of mitigation in place. There's a huge amount of education that needs to be done, because the most important thing is acclimatization. And actually, it's quite a subtle science, acclimatization. The way you can pre-acclimatize, then train, then keep acclimatizing a little bit to keep yourself acclimatized, because when you do go through acclimatization for a week or two, actually quality of training will reduce. So you've got to time that very carefully. And if athletes aren't fully acclimatized, one, they won't perform, and secondly, it's a danger to their health, particularly in some sports.
Nice to see Mary Blackman, an alumnus, saying, "Hooray, we look forward to Tokyo 2021, which I think we all share. There are lots of questions coming in, so I'll keep going to those. There are two kind of related about anti-doping agencies, and are they involved in cases such as that of Caster Semenya? And also, what work is going on regarding transgender athletes, and what do you think the next step of that debate is?
Yes, well, the IOC had a consensus statement back in 2015 on transgender athletes and hyperandrogenism in sport. There was a recommendation. It was only a recommendation. It's not a policy, from the scientists then, for transgender female athletes to be able to be eligible to compete in women's events if their testosterone was reduced below 10 nanomoles per litre for a year. Now, there's lots of controversy around that now, and it's being looked at very carefully. A number of sports have gone independently down their own route. We've had a lot of conferences, and the IOC in the process of putting together a framework. So it won't be guidance, it'll be a framework for sports to decide on fairness and eligibility in light of gender and transgender, and it is hugely challenging, and there's such opposing views on both sides, from those who, particularly on the human rights end, who are saying that anyone who expresses a certain gender, they should be able to decide on their eligibility to compete in sport, through those who say that anyone who is transgender should not be allowed to compete at all. And obviously the right answer is somewhere in the middle. and clearly it's also going to be sport specific. So there are some sports and disciplines where there's far more advantage than others, and then there's possible safety issues as well. And I think what we're driving for is for it to be individualized as well as sport specific as far as it possibly can be, so that everyone has a chance, and you maximize the inclusivity without compromising the fundamental thing in sport, which is fairness. But it's not being easy, and we've had lots of consultations with cisgender athletes, transgender athletes, hyperandrogenic athletes, and many of those involved in their care and the support staff as well.
We've been talking mainly about physical health. David Denton, what's being done to address mental health issues amongst athletes?
Yes, and this is a real issue. We had a consensus meeting on mental health just over 2 years ago now, and the two whole issues of the British Journal of Sport Medicine were devoted to mental health in elite athletes. And it's clear that although the incidence of mental health problems in elite athletes may not be higher than the general population, it's very much influenced by the environment they're in, and the stresses that those athletes are under, and not least of which is transition when you're retiring, particularly if you have to retire because of injury or suddenly, or it's not a planned retirement. And with that big life change come real issues. So there are there's a working group who've continued since then, and just published literally a week ago. Oh no, maybe just accepted it. Maybe it's coming out next month. Is a tool which anyone who's supporting athletes can use to screen their athletes for any mental health issues. And there's also a toolbox and a work kit for governing bodies, for national federations to actually use to make sure they put in place the support that's needed for athletes. And this links to the whole issue of prevention of harassment and abuse in sport, which is also extremely topical and is being addressed by the IOC, with the importance of safeguarding officers in every club, in every sport, and making sure that they have the proper training they need, and the proper structure to back them up.
Richard, we are getting lots and lots of questions. We're going to go for about another 15 minutes, if that's okay with you. And I want to bring in, just before the end, a current representative of SCBC as well, to just state what you can do if you want to be involved in sport now. But a question now from an incoming fellow who is a medic, Grant Stewart. We've realised this year that sport is the most important of unimportant things, he says. In that spirit, has the work going on within sports medicine been able to influence clinical medicine, especially at the moment when we need assistance from experts in diverse fields to overcome COVID?
Yes, no, that's a very good question, and I think I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer it, because I've been out of the scene in the UK for 8 years now, but certainly the British Association of Sport and Exercise Medicine and the Faculty of Sport and Exercise Medicine, who really work very closely together and a lot of people in common, have been very active. And I've seen that because I've seen it coming through on the internet. I don't know how effective it's been in the UK, but very active in promoting the importance of people continuing to exercise, the importance of exercise for immunity, for reducing your risk factors of developing severe COVID disease. And so I think there's certainly an understanding there. And it was quite a long time ago now that sport medicine became sport and exercise medicine, in recognition of the importance of exercise really in promoting health as well as as a treatment for so many diseases.
Penelope Jarrett puts you on the spot. Do you do any rowing still, or any other training or sport?
Yes. Well, one of those funny things, I don't know if you'll sympathize, Roger, is as you get a certain age, one little twinge resolves and another comes along to replace it. But I do go rowing almost every weekend, and I'm looking out at the lake here, which dusk has more or less fallen now. But there's a little rowing club literally 200 meters away from the IOC headquarters. So it's non-competitive, but anyone who's rowed will know that when you go out in doubles or quads, and if there's another boat on the lake or the river, it becomes competitive. But it's not officially competitive, and we're out there to exercise and appreciate the ambiance. And then I mean, Switzerland is an extraordinary place for outdoor exercise. So I used to hate walking, now I love hiking, and I've always loved cycling and skiing as well.
This actually ties in brilliantly with a question from Paul Worsnop, who says he was here 71 to 74. Is there evidence of long-term adverse musculoskeletal effects from rowing at a high level? So he's asking, how are your shoulders and knees?
Well, of course, in rowing, the most common injury is backs, and knees are generally protected. And all right, happen to have a knee issue at the moment, but I don't think it's anything to do with rowing. It's to do with other sports and activities. So rowing, and they did quite a bit of research on this way back, is one of the safer sports up there with swimming, etc. And of course, some of the most dangerous are things like rugby, and most lethal potentially is equestrian. But then there's other sports that have come along more recently, like BMX, which are pretty exciting as well. So it very much depends on what sport you do. And in the IOC, we are very concerned for the long-term health of athletes as well as their immediate health, and that's one of the drives of our priority of prevention. And with the World Olympians Association, we've been doing a study with Debbie Palmer-Green, an excellent British Olympian. She's been leading that study, but it's been international, looking at the musculoskeletal health of ex-Olympians. And comparing to a control population. And when you look at that study, and it's just coming out, it's being finalized at the moment, and the other studies in the past, generally it's reassuring. I mean, it's very difficult, isn't it, to control for the sort of other factors that will affect whether someone becomes an Olympian. You know, they might have all sorts of other health benefits, but generally it seems to be pretty good. But the big concern, as you were saying, is musculoskeletal injury, and the huge. It's where someone's injured and then carries on training. That's where the issues are. If you're lucky enough to get away without any serious injuries, then you'll be fine. But if you carry on training through those injuries, then that's such pressure to do so, that's where there's issues. So I think that is a concern, and as anyone in the entourage of an athlete, and particularly the doctor and physiotherapy, have to always prioritize the long-term health of the athlete. And it's easy to say, it's really difficult to do when there's an Olympics a few months away.
Now, a couple of people have asked about a certain person called Steve Redgrave. So let me ask you, Michael Drake's question. Did you really think Steve Redgrave would row on so long and successfully? And very interesting question, I think. Was there anything obvious which set him apart even back in 1984?
Yes, I mean, he was pretty young in 1984. He was the youngster in the crew at 21. But even then, he was a phenomenon. And I always remember we had a 4 which was going very fast, and Steve was actually trying to make it in a single scull, because that there's something special about being in a single. And he saw our 4 going fast, and our coach Mike Sprackney managed to persuade him to sub into our 4, and we'd raced in this international regatta on the Saturday and won. By less than a length. He jumped in the boat and we won by 3 lengths. So, even though he hadn't been in it before, he just made the boat go fast. So we knew it was something special then. But I never dreamt he would go on to win 4 more gold medals. And even more so to do it while developing diabetes and ulcerative colitis. I mean, just astonishing. So I was actually there because I was the chief medical officer for the British team in Sydney, and in 2000, which was his final one, and it was extraordinarily emotional moment. When they won by such a small margin, but they won, and that's sport, isn't it? It's the you don't know what's going to happen, and it does, and that's what makes people so addicted to it.
Okay, last couple of questions coming up, and Malcolm Harrison, can you see changes that are implemented for the postponed Tokyo Games becoming part of Paris and future Olympics? So will there be some changes that the IOC might have been thinking about which are going to happen more quickly because of COVID?
Well, that's a very good question from my captain. because Malcolm
Yes,
was
he's
the
mentioned
captain
something
when I
about a
was vice
combined
captain.
Clare boat in 1980. So I
Yes,
think he,
that's
yeah.
it. That was our. Yeah, that was the one I was mentioning earlier, where we got through to the Saturday. So Malcolm pulled that along, but. No, I think you're absolutely right, because there's an opportunity, like all these things, huge challenge, but there's always opportunities. And the opportunity now with Tokyo is to try and make it a more simple games. We have to, and the thing people are talking about is this post-corona world, where we'll actually try and, because the games is just, there's huge pressure to make it bigger and bigger and more sophisticated and complicated. But we have to, if it's going to be doable by any other than the biggest, richest cities in the world, then it has to be more simple. And I think there's a big drive, because of the pressures of delaying it and postponing it for a year, to simplify things, and you know, come back to the essence of it, which is the sport, and that's the thing we all love. And you know, if we focus totally on the sport, and all right, there's going to be a certain amount of celebration. The presentation is very important, but I think a good number of lessons have been learnt about the fact that we can do things in a more simple way.
I'm going to bring Maria Chukanova in a moment, so she'd like to put her video on. She's currently representing SCBC, but there is a directly relevant question, Richard, to your Selwyn days. Harry Main says, hiya, just wondering what seat you rode in for Selwyn M1.
I think I was normally at 3, and then I might have been promoted to 5. Malcolm will remember in my final year.
Malcolm
But,
says 5, actually. He's just put a
yes,
question in,
5.
so.
Yes. I think in my very first year, because Malcolm came a year after me, my very first year I was 3, and after that I was at 5. Yes, because I was undoubtedly the heaviest.
Richard, for now, huge thanks. I'll come back and say thank you again in a moment or two, because this has been extraordinarily interesting, both about your own career and about the Olympics and about sport medicine. But can I just bring in, before we say goodbye, Maria, who is representing the boat club now. And Maria, I guess you've got about a minute to tell us if people coming into the college or people in the college want to be involved in the boat club, how do they do it?
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you to both of you for doing this. Thank you so much, Richard, for just being so nice about all the organisation moments. But yeah, if you're a fresher and you would like to row for Selwyn, we're going to have a taster day on the 10th of October, so put that in your calendars where you can try it out. And also, I believe our lower boats captains have been emailing you around all the information about it. And at the moment, the committee is working super hard to make it happen in the current conditions, to make it all safe for everyone. So I think at the moment, with the British rowing guidelines, it looks like we're going to be able to have people trying rowing at Cambridge, which is quite exciting. So definitely give it a try, because, you know, if Richard chose to row for Selwyn over the boat race, probably worth it.
Maria, I would like to thank you and everybody who's working to get sport back at Selwyn. And I think this is an important point for people watching the webinar tonight, that we are obviously putting health and safety have to come first, but we are also determined that people do get as much college life as possible, and sport is a really, really important part of that. So thank you for all that you and all the other sports captains in Selwyn are doing. Richard, I just want to say John Woodhouse also confirms you were number 5 and says, good stuff, buddy. So I assume he was part of the crew as well?
Yes, he was. Yes. It was Malcolm, John, and myself were the representatives from Selwyn, and then the others were from Clare. So it was a happy memory.
Okay, and Richard Pelly says, excellent webinar, very interesting. Thanks and well done, applauding. And that's because I sometimes say the only thing we regret about these webinars is you can't hear the applause ringing out around Britain and all over the place. You know, people I'm sure are really appreciative of your time, and also just very proud of the fact that you are a Selwynite who has made such a difference, both in your sporting achievements and then actually consolidating them into making a difference to literally world sport. So, you know, huge appreciation, and thanks very much to you and to everyone who's joined us tonight. And Malcolm Harrison says also, well done, very interesting. We are keeping these seminars going, and the next one is focused particularly on current students. So I'm very pleased to say that the actor Tom Hollander, who's an honorary fellow of Selwyn, will be joining us next week. So look out for details of that. And if you're watching BBC One at the moment, or the iPlayer with Us, his current series, he'll be talking about that, and also about how he went from reading English at Selwyn to becoming one of the best known actors today, and plenty of other seminars coming up in the coming weeks as well. So keep an eye on the alumni events page, or if you're a current student, I will pester you by email to tell you about it. Richard, thanks again. Thanks very much indeed.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure.
And
Thanks
we will
again
look
to
forward
both
to
of
a
you.
brilliant, thanks Maria as well. And we'll look forward to Tokyo 2021, which I think is going to be wonderful. So good luck with that.
I agree. I agree. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks everybody. Goodbye. See you soon.
Right. Bye-bye.